Hey everybody, welcome back to Listography. Jason, Joe, and Krams are here, and we are recapping the 80s for you. If anyone is new to the channel, we've got a series called Albums of the Year here, where every Friday we each make our pick for our favorite album of that year, and we also give you 4 runners up each. So we did this for the 70s, where we made a couple videos recapping the decade. We're doing the same for the 80s, and we're going to give you a couple extra videos for the 80s even. We're going to do 5 videos, so you're going to have videos all week looking back at the 80s. To start it off, we're going to have a little discussion about some of the 70s artists that fared the best in the 80s. It was a rough decade for a lot of the classic rockers. So we're going to, give you some picks for the ones that we thought did pretty well. And I'm sure along the way, we'll also mention those that didn't do so well.
Started off just a couple of notes. As someone who loves In Through the Outdoor by Zeppelin, thought it really would have been cool to see what they had in them, at least for the first half of the 80s. But then, obviously that wasn't going to happen. And, there's a good list of artists here that I think did really well. But I'm going to start talking about some artists that didn't. I think The Who really dropped off, unfortunately, even though I think some of those albums like It's Hard or Face Dances are a little bit better than people give credit for. It just doesn't come close to adding up. That to me is probably the biggest drop off for me, which really sucks because I love The Who. But the ones that I'm looking at, I think Peter Gabriel, coming from what early Genesis sounded like to how creative he got in the studio in the 80s, stands out. Bowie has been a chameleon his entire career, and he was almost effortlessly been able to do what he wanted to do in the 80s. But my number one pick is Rush. Rush, I love the 80s output a lot. They were able to take all of the elements of what they did as a really big prog band in the 70s and just condense them into really good pop rock music. And I'm convinced if Geddy had a different sounding voice, that they would have just taken off. I mean, some of the albums they did in the later 80s, I'm just blown away by how good of pop songs some of the stuff are on Hold Your Fire and Power Windows, and the rock music on Signals and Grace Under Pressure to me are just awesome. And just the sound of his voice just isn't really cut for mainstream radio. They're not a music video band. And I think really if Steve Perry was the singer of Rush, they would have been maybe the biggest band of the 80s, because all of the other elements are there. And I just love the way that their prog sound shape-shifted into the more of a pop songwriting formula. I think it worked perfectly. I have no problem with the introduction of the synths at all, from it being used a little bit in Moving Pictures to a lot in Signals and Grace Under Pressure. I don't think Alex, even though he's not always the driving force of the songwriting for their 80s stuff like he was in the 70s, I don't think he loses his mystique at all. In fact, I think some of it's kind of even amplified because he's got to just do a lot of texture work. So for me, that's the band that I think transitioned the best. But there were a lot. Petty, I was considering too. I think Petty is there. I thought about the Cars for a second, but almost like immediately with their stuff, they were already ready for the 80s. So I don't really think that one is big of a leap. But yeah, I think for me, I love Rush. Obviously, we've talked about it a lot on the channel. I love their 70s stuff, but the cream of the crop run for me starts around 1980. So
yeah, Rush is probably, I pretty much blatantly have said on this channel before that I prefer 80s Rush to the prog 70s stuff. I like the 70s stuff, but I definitely prefer the 80s. I think they probably, if not the best, they were one of the 3 or 4, artists from the 70s that transitioned just completely seamlessly. And before I get into like my pick, there were some artists, you had a lot of these like late 70s artists that kind of were ready for the 80s right off the bat, like Van Halen and Kate Bush, Prince. He started, his first 2 albums were in the 70s, but he's an 80s artist. So I didn't include people like that. Same with the Cars, like Kramser mentioned. It's sort of, they were ready for the 80s. They didn't have that kind of like classic 70s sound that needed a big transition. And then somebody like Elvis Costello sort of never really changed that much. He sort of just continued doing what he was doing. And I think he seamlessly kind of transitioned by not transitioning much. For me, probably, and I like a lot like Rush. I like 70s and 80s a lot. And they, have a lot of lineup changes. A lot of people don't like their 80s output, or they don't like the 70s output. But for me, Genesis, the way they were able to change up the band, in 76, going with Phil Collins on vocals instead of Peter Gabriel. I love their 80s output. I love, from Duke all the way to Invisible Touch. They only had 5 albums in the 80s, but I love them all. I love their 70s stuff, but they were really able to sort of, take their prog, just like Rush, and sort of transform it into tighter, more pop songs. And they were even more poppy than Rush, really. They really went for, the full pop experience, the synth pop. But I Phil Collins, I thought he pulled it off well, the whole band. Just really great stuff. I can't decide which I like more, but Genesis. And then bonus, Judas Priest, also excellent in the 80s, even though they were a 70s band, probably the best metal band that transitioned from 70s and 80s. No problem for them.
It's kind of interesting. You guys went Rush and Genesis, and I think the three least likely bands to succeed in the 80s actually did the best job. And I would add Yes to the mix as well. These heavy prog acts that should have had no chance. I mean, what they were doing in the 70s was completely irrelevant by the 80s, and all three of them managed somehow to adapt to the times and change their sound, which I'm sure, a lot of their fans from the 70s weren't crazy about the new direction, but I mean, they did what they had to do, and they had some of their biggest hits of their careers in the 80s.
Because the music IQ is there right off the get-go. Like, it's...
A couple others, I think ZZ Top did a great job changing their sound up, streamlined the production a bit, made it a little slicker. Like Cram mentioned, Tom Petty's a good example, although he kind of came out in the late 70s, so it wasn't a huge leap, but I think his 80s stuff is great.
Can't forget Aerosmith, too. Classic. I mean, they're sort of the poster boys for burned out 70s rock stars. They weren't like Rush or Genesis, where they kind of kept going and with, grew in popularity really from the 70s and 80s. They completely disappeared at the end of the 70s and then sort of just reappeared sort of by magic thanks to Run DMC and some good producers, and became one of the best, selling artists of the late 80s. Bunch of, from Permanent Vacation, Pump, and right into the 90s, really.
Got to throw Ozzy out there, too. I mean, considering where Black Sabbath was and what that sounded like when it first came out, and, pretty tumultuous breakups, all that stuff, but really good solo work throughout the 80s. But it is interesting, you got someone like, you're talking about like Aerosmith kind of like going away and coming back. You've got someone like Neil Young, who was just kind of like floundering, but was still being really prolific, putting out what I thought were really lousy 80s albums, and then just like saving grace at the end of the decade and like shot him back like out of a cannon. For me, I love his late 80s, early 90s stuff. So, going through those struggles without quitting and just kind of like grinding it up. I don't think of Neil Young as an 80s artist, but for someone like Rush or even Genesis, although I don't agree with your pick, I think of Rush with like an 80s period and a 70s period, and just like kind of goes flawlessly for me. So
what about bands who didn't do a good job transitioning from the 70s and 80s? I always think of, I like their 80s stuff a bit. I'm not crazy about it, but Queen sort of, they're very hit or miss in the 80s. They had some good stuff, but compared to their 70s output, I don't think there's anyone. It's not like Genesis where you can say, well, they had these albums in the 70s and, they were still big in the 80s. They kind of, I don't think anyone prefers 80s Queen to 70s Queen. That would be a leap.
That's an interesting question to put to our UK viewers, because their popularity in the US in the 80s totally went off a cliff after the Game, I guess, is probably where it dropped off. But they stayed huge in Europe for the duration of the 80s pretty much, I think. So be interesting to see what people think of their 80s output from the UK or from other places in Europe or wherever.
I'd put Elton John up there. Like when we do our Elton John redo list, I mean it's going to be just chronologically just so segregated between the 80s and the 70s. I don't think that they're among my favorites, but I think the Rolling Stones did a bit better than people give them credit for. Tattoo You is pretty good. I like Steel Wheels a lot. I don't think the Stones had as much good stuff as the 70s, obviously, but I don't think they completely fell apart, maybe like the way the Who did. I think the Who was a drastic difference. But yeah, you got to really appreciate like someone like Bowie, who never really took time off and just like so quickly went from what the hunky dory sounded like to Ziggy to Low to Let's Dance. Like it's just night and day, these albums, and it's awesome.
I think there's a lot of artists like singer-songwriter types, especially where the 70s production just worked so well with their sound. And even though they still might have been writing good songs in the 80s, the production just destroyed it. People like Jackson Browne or Warren Zevon, their 80s output just doesn't do it for me.
Good call.
But yeah, interested to see what people say. I know some of the people that we mentioned as being very successful at transitioning into the 80s. I know there's a lot of people out there that hate those bands' 80s output. So let us know what you think. Who did it well? Who didn't succeed at transitioning into the 80s? Be sure to like the video. Hit the bell for notifications after you subscribe. Check down in the description for links to social media. And keep an eye out all week. We've got a whole slate of videos planned to recap the 80s before we hit 1990 on Friday. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.